Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What is the International Committee of the Red Cross? What is the International Committee of the Red Cross doing to provide humanitarian assistance to literally millions of people in various areas of the world? My guest today is going to bring us up to date on this very important organization. My guest today is Dr. Phillips Spoerri. Dr. Phillips Spoerri is the permanent observer of the International Committee of the Red Cross to the United Nations. Dr. Spoerri, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Well, thank you for having me here.
I appreciate you being with me. Let's start right at the top. What is the International Committee of the Red Cross? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Well, it's an old creature. It's really the humanitarian organization that was created over 150 years ago. And it was nearly one of the sole actors, probably, until you had the organizations of the United Nations and other NGOs stepping in. It was founded at a time to respond to situations of war where one discovered that many people, particularly victims of war, were left unattended. So at the time, the International Committee of the Red Cross did basically three things. It created its own organization, but it helped to create in every country in the world a national organization to be ready when difficult times arrive, particularly war. So you had the creation of national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, but something else that was very important, from the very beginning, the International Committee of the Red Cross also worked to the end that international law, international humanitarian law, or also called the International Law of Armed Conflict, was created to support this kind of work and protect victims of armed conflict. So 150 years ago, a very important thing, creation of this organization that then sprouted up to today, and you could say old, but very much alive and kicking today.
Yeah, alive and kicking and doing well. How many countries are you operating in, roughly?
Yeah, we're really in 80 countries in the world, where we would have, let's say, a delegation, a main office, but then, of course, in the countries, sub-delegation offices that are there. And when you ask the question, of course, still you will always know that we will be in the most difficult places. That's where you usually find us.
Mm-hmm. And countries, individual countries have their own many, I guess most possibly have their own Red Cross, like the American Red Cross, or whatever the case might be. But do you partner in, where you're operating internationally, you partner with the local groups in those countries? For example, if you're in Kuwait, or if you're wherever it might be in Afghanistan, so you'll be partnering with them as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the International Committee of the Red Cross is really the founding organization of what you would call the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to explain to a larger audience, but we have the International Committee. They also have a federative body, which is called the International Federation, and then you have all these national societies. We meet every 4 years and we have joint policies, but for us, and that is the big strength of the International Committee of the Red Cross, while we are an independent organization, we're part of this family. So if we operate, for example, in Syria, we work together with our brother or sister organization, like the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and we can then rely also on the work of, millions of volunteers around the world.
And our viewers, of course, can go to www.icrc.org to get more information about the programs we're going to talk about today, and many of them that we will not have a chance to get to. We're also going to be talking about a variety of other things too. I noticed on your website, you have on there that there are basic principles that are underlying all of your missions. You talk about humanity, you talk about neutrality. Talk about some of those principles and why they're so important in the outreach that you do to provide services.
Well, I explained the origin of our organization, and very much the origin was working in wars, but also in other situations of catastrophes that arose. And also based on some of the law that has emerged, we just discovered that in order to carry out our work and be accepted, that certain principles work. So these are really time-tested sort of principles that accompany at least our way of operating. And of course, the overall is really the impulse. I mean, it is to work for humanity. That is the biggest overarching principle. But then as really operating principles, for us, it's very important to be independent. So we are not a government organization. That means we do not depend on anybody ordering what to do. We have the independence of deciding for ourselves. That is one thing. But then one principle that is very important, and that's what relies on us, is neutrality. It's sometimes not always well understood, is that when you work in an armed conflict, when you're going to some place, I mean, we don't so much categorize between the good and the bad guys, we try to have a contact with all sides in order to simply be able to work for the respect of the law and to be able to reach the people. So we depend very much on them saying that we do not take sides. Now, this is something that we have to respect, and this is something that is a principle that has worked. So it is something we very, very carefully work for and are attentive that we do not run into perception problems. We work hard to maintain this neutrality. And another very important principle is impartiality. That is, I mean, you could say the ambulance driver, when you see somebody lying on the ground who's injured or attacked, you don't pick the person up or not pick them up because you say wrong gender, wrong tribe. No, when the needs are there, we assist all persons who then are in need. A wounded is attended for in war, and there's no reasons not to do it. So that is this impartiality, to really base our approach only on the needs and not with any discrimination.
So you don't have a political or ethnic test, or anyway, if anyone's in need, they receive services. That is the approach, and it is also the approach that you find. It's not some. That goes 150 years back. Wounded soldiers on the battlefield, once they can no more fight, their weapons are down, then they are supposed to be attended, and you're supposed to also attend the wounded of your enemy. That was the argument, and of course, when one thinks of civilians, even more the case. Once they need this help, one is supposed to be allowed to impartially assist these people, even in very difficult situations. Now, we were talking about partners, and of course talking about within the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, that network, but also I'm sure you have many other partners. Who are some of your partners in the perhaps United Nations agencies, private sector? We couldn't identify all private sector people, but are there some key people that you work with? It would vary from country to country, undoubtedly, but who are some of your other partners?
Well, I think it really varies, like from context to context, who would be concretely partners on the ground. But if I just take my function here at the United Nations in New York, we do not work under an organization, we're our own, but we do have to also very much coordinate approaches. That's why we're very engaged in looking what the United Nations is doing, making sure that in the field there are no overlaps, that these things are well coordinated. So we do very much participate in coordination mechanisms of the United Nations, and depending on topics, we will seek partnerships. In the field, things can happen very spontaneously, that you are in a situation. Sometimes we find ourselves alone on the ground, because in the most difficult, there are not so many actors in war situations who are still on the ground. You will find organizations like Doctors Without Borders, and sometimes circumstances will arrive that we have to partner. But I think in many contexts we will depending on what is the field, whether it is water or health, we will be partnering with local organizations and as I said, coordinating very well our work with all major actors, including and very importantly also with the United Nations.
Now, of the 80 plus countries that you're operating in today, let's look at some of the your four basic areas. Really, you have five basic areas that you're focusing upon. Health being one, prevention work, different things like that. I know you personally, you've worked in Yemen, you've been in Afghanistan, been in Kuwait, in Israel, in the occupied territories. So you've got a very vast experience in this area. But let's just start off with the first one, say prevention work. What are one or two specifics of countries where you're working to prevent problems, to prevent humanitarian disasters, and what are you doing to provide assistance in those countries?
Well, I will actually pick up your question from the second part, where
Please
you
do.
said where you see what we practically do. If you take examples of Syria today, Iraq, Afghanistan, those are major operations. We're always one of the biggest actors on the ground, and usually one of the organizations that are closest to the fighting situations. You will always see us trying to bring assistance in terms of relief, big efforts in terms of water. In Syria, I think about 16 million people are somehow benefiting from work we're doing on the water systems. Lots of activities in the health part, but also activities which are more in what we would call protection related. We try to visit prisons carry out activities, also report on violations of the law of war, of international humanitarian law, and intervene with the parties to the conflict to improve their behavior. And we will also be supporting in a lot of our work there the national societies, our partner organizations. So a vast array of areas where we operate. So those are the areas. And when you look at the prevention work, because you mentioned prevention work, I mean, here at the United Nations, prevention work would be, let's say, the political work. What can you do to avoid conflicts? That is not the role of the International Committee of the Red Cross. We are more the ones operating once the problems have started. When we speak of prevention work, nevertheless, we do a lot of work in what we call prevention, is to instruct on the law of armed conflict, armed forces, that they understand it, work on national legislation, that anything that has to do with international humanitarian law is integrated into national legal systems. We will try to do things in the education system so that the people are prepared, that they know what it is, and you will hope that that will influence, better behavior when things get difficult. So that is a prevention work that we do very actively.
And given some of the philosophies of the various governments and what have you, that could be quite a challenge, could it not, to try to work with them? I'm sure you work with them and their legal system, the judicial system, the educational system, to try to help them better understand the legal ramifications of what exactly exists in current law and what could happen in the future. That can be very challenging.
I think that is very challenging, but I would say, generally speaking, when you work on this kind of structural work in supporting, I think that it is very well received. What can be more difficult is when you're actually in a conflict and you have to report things that are not going well, and you have to engage in a sort of a bilateral dialogue to point out violations of the law and change behavior. I mean, that is a trickier art, but that is extremely important, because I think that, more generally speaking, our biggest challenge, or one of the biggest, is working for better compliance of international law, international humanitarian law in particular.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to the website, www.globalconnectionstelevision.com, to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an intra-campus university TV network, or just a website, then you have an interest in these international topics, please feel free to download the programs and distribute them. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge, at no cost, as a public service to help us better understand how we're living in an interdependent world, and international issues do impact us no matter where we live. Today we're looking at the International Committee of the Red Cross, and my guest is Dr. Phillips Spoerri, who is the permanent observer of the International Committee of the Red Cross at the United Nations. Dr. Spoerri, we were talking about your networking with the United Nations and also with some other groups around the world, really come right down to it. One other part, and we've been talking about it to some degree, is cooperation. That's one of your main building blocks, if you will. We've talked about some of the networking that you're doing. What other types of efforts of cooperation or outreach are you doing to help fulfill your mission and to achieve your goals?
Well, cooperation, we have several building blocks. I mean, the work here, for example, just in New York, if you take that, is to work also that all the states, other organizations really understand our specific roles. So is, of course, explaining what we do. We have a huge element of cooperation, and that I explained in the first part with you was really to say this huge cooperation with our national partners, the Red Cross and the Red Crescent societies, but of course other NGOs, and of course also the UN in multiple instances where we have to cooperate together with them.
Another area is in the health area. And that, of course, this is a major concern to all of us, everybody around the world. What is the International Committee doing in that area?
Well, it's interesting that you ask the question. I mean, I always feel that when one thinks of Red Cross, one somehow thinks of health and hospitals, and so it's actually a natural association. And when I spoke about going 150 years back, the reason for creating it was seeing that wounded soldiers lying on the battlefield were unattended for. It was the medical services. So the idea was to secure that one would be able to treat these patients on the ground more effectively. So from the origin, treating wounded was something very much on the Red Cross agenda. Today, even in our programming, a very important part. We have huge teams out there in the medical field. War surgery is a specialty of ours. Really, just there at the battlefield, people are wounded, surgeons doing that. But it's much broader than that. If I think about Afghanistan, for example, I think we probably have the biggest orthopedic project in the world going on there. 1,000 people working in there, nearly all of them people who have been handicapped, usually through mines and unexploded ordnances in Afghanistan. So orthopedics is one, but you could also say all the work with national societies is the emergency work, ambulances, picking up the people. So yes, health is a major theme, a major activity for us, but also national societies.
Mm-hmm. Now, in September of this past year, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 logical, practical, quantifiable goals that they're going to work on over the next 15 years, the development agenda, 2030 development agenda, and of course goals such as eradicating poverty, eradicating hunger, promoting gender equity, and 14 more, if I counted that right. Yeah. But anyway, they are really very, very laudable goals. How do you factor these goals into just about everything you are doing? There are some of those goals that tie into them. Do you discuss these frequently, or do you? I know you're a strong supporter probably of the Sustainable Development Goals, but how do you factor them into your planning and implementation of your programs?
Well, first of all, the first remark is that it is really, really laudable that this agenda, was adopted last year, a big success and a very, very ambitious program, a necessary program. And obviously we relate, strongly to it. But I would say that we really look at the weaker side of it. It's the worry that it's the no one is left behind. Since our area, the International Committee in particular, our area is very much working in armed conflict situations, but other situations where violence is endemic, that these are areas where actually people can be left behind. And if we look at the news every day, we actually see that some places it's not getting better, it's getting worse, and sometimes one has the feeling that this worse is spreading. Now this is of course seeing the world from our perspective. Others would see the good news. We see a lot of the bad news, and we really have to, that's really where we are striving for, is that also these areas where conflict is happening, that these are not left behind, and that we find ways to respond in these areas and do it in such an intelligent way that it's not just emergency response, that it also can lead over to a more developmental approach, and that some of these areas it will look better by 2030, hopefully.
One issue that's really gained a tremendous amount of traction over the past several years has been climate change, and a large part because of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the UN conferences, and a lot of players have come together on this. But we're starting now to identify this as one of the major problems as far as creating chaotic situations, creating situations where people are competing for scarce resources, where people are going to war with one another. We saw it really in Syria. That was one of the main reasons that people left the countryside, because of diverting the water resources, and also a situation where they were having a desertification taking place. But do you find that more and more as you look at your activities out there, that some of these I won't call it extraneous, but somewhat of an activity or an event like climate change is helping to create these problems that you're dealing with?
Well, it's a difficult question because obviously these causes are always multifaceted, and they to scientifically say that is the cause. But yes, of course, desertification, water issues, scarcity, and people having to leave. Also, if one looks at in some countries, one can actually foresee the way water will run out, or people moving actually into areas due to flooding. Those are all factors that if they are not well managed, they can lead to more tensions and more conflictuality. And that leads just back to what I was saying saying before, is in relation to the Agenda 2030, if these things are not managed well, in some areas you will have things going worse rather than better. So in order to be successful, this has to be very, very carefully factored in our forward-looking thinking.
Now, as you move forward, what are one or two of the major challenges you see with the for the International Committee of the Red Cross? As far as I'm sure funding is always a problem. It is with every organization. But what are some of the other problems that you see looming on the horizon, or challenges, let's say, that the committee will be dealing with?
Well, I will pick up on the funding part, not to dwell into it, but just to say I think it's something that those listening or hearing and seeing us should know, is that, I mean, our organization is bigger than it was ever since the Second World War. And this is not just because we want to be bigger, it is because we are seeing more conflicts, more situations where we have to respond, more needs. So we're responding more than we ever had to, because we really see that there is this bigger need. However, that is the constant thing all organizations are saying. Although we're doing more money is spent, the gap is getting even bigger. So that is a major challenge. I just wanted to flag that one just to have said it. However, if I would, looking at us as an organization working again in conflicts or situations of violence, I mean, one of our big challenges, and that will be no surprise, is simply the strong disrespect for the law. We would say the erosion for the respect of law, huge violations of humanitarian law that happen. How can one change the behavior not to see many of the atrocities we are witnessing these days? That is a constant struggle to find means and ways to first raise the bar, preserve these standards that have been, civilizatory achievements in terms of law and principles, that these are safeguarded, but then also find means and ways to practically seek to protect and assist people. That is probably the challenge. I could go down to a specific one, and we have been campaigning for years on something we called healthcare in danger. Because for years we've now been seeing more and more hospitals attacked in conflicts, medical workers stopped from doing their work, doctors killed, and we were trying to empirically looking, is this really something new? But it is getting worse. We have so many situations. So we worked very much to campaign on this issue, and we were absolutely delighted this May when the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution exactly on this topic of protecting medical work in armed conflicts. And obviously behind the scenes we tried to give our knowledge and input into something like that, but that was a great example of working together here in New York with the United Nations.
And of course, our viewers can go to www.icrc.org for more information on these programs. And I believe you're a 501c3 organization, are you not? And they can make donations if they would like. We were talking about funding, which I'm sure that would be very helpful.
Well, there you get to funding. I have to say it. The funding, the private donations that can be made in countries go to the national society. If you're in the US, it's the American Red Cross that will take the private donations. There are some areas where we do. We are actually, and that's interesting, we're over 90% funded by governments, and the rest national societies, and only 5% private funding. The national societies, they are largely funded through private fundraising.
Wonderful. And fortunately, our program goes worldwide. So that means you're going to get some coverage in lots of countries around the world. Well, let me ask you just in closing, the last 30 seconds or so. We've talked about your organization. What do you see as a major challenge to the United Nations? There are many challenges to the UN, but is there one out there that you think that the UN is going to have to focus on more so? And the hardest question in 30 seconds.
I think it is clear. You can see it. I think even the spectators would say is, how does one manage to get some of these festering conflicts to stop? How can one prevent? How can one stop? Though it's really the making peace in this world. I think that is a huge agenda. So it is the agenda. What you were asking me about prevention, I think prevention is a huge agenda, and of course, then beyond that you will have others. But from the development work and climate and all these big challenges. But looking for me, I think peace and preventing conflict is a major one.
Well, Dr. Phillips Spoerri, the permanent observer of the International Committee of the Red Cross at the United Nations. So you're dealing with some very important issues. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. It was a pleasure.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.